Hi, guys. How are you doing this morning? It feels like we have come through 3 seasons together, doesn't it? Um, yes, do make sure you say good morning or hello or I'm here or whatever. Um, but we started out uh, with summer, right, together, and then we kind of watched it move into fall. And when I woke up this morning and looked out the door, I thought, okay, well, winter is really here. Um, I think by the time you get to mid to late November, it pretty much does feel like winter to me. I always think of really winter beginning December 1st. That I don't care what they tell me, but I often don't care what people tell me about seasons. So it's sort of how it feels. Yes, it is snowing. Good morning, Andrew and Jason and everybody. Um, So I've been thinking about you guys a lot, as of course I always do, and worrying about your health and safety, as I also always do. Um, so if you're driving, be careful in the snow if it accumulates at all. And I've already had so many students either test positive for COVID or have roommates and suite mates and friends who have tested positive that, of course, I'm concerned. And last time I looked, I think we were at 75 active cases. So my expectation and my hope is that you will probably actually be sent home a little earlier rather than a little later. Um, I don't know that, of course, but um, I would be surprised if this administration didn't do that. Um, so I hope whatever is going on that you can make these adjustments because I know you're at 94. Well, then there isn't any question. You will certainly be going home early. And I know that must be just really disorienting. It's kind of like it's disorienting enough to live in a box with mask on. And then if you have to keep moving the box, that's even stranger and harder. So, take your time, give yourself a bit of time and, some deep breaths because this has not been an easy fall for any of you. I know. And I'm really proud of those of you who have truly stuck it out and more than stuck it out and really put in some effort this fall, even when it wasn't always easy. And I know you all have other classes that you're worrying about as well. But I look at students like Emma Larber and Chloe and many, many others and think, I'm really proud of you guys. So I think even though it may not have been your best semester, that you can take pride in whichever classes or whichever activities you were able to do well as you might have hoped. And whichever ones you didn't do that with. And certainly some of you know that you've been certainly coasting in this class. I don't know if that's been true for others as well. You can learn from that, it's okay. You can forgive yourself and just kind of take it in and move on. And maybe next time tell yourself, well, I'll choose my classes more carefully, or I will start earlier to be organized and I will, sort of do things as they come in rather than letting things accumulate and then panic and have to do them at the last minute. Whatever those lessons are, you are never defined by what you have done in the past. You get to change that. you get to change your own trajectory. So I just hope you'll remember that and know that you don't have to beat yourself up about mistakes. You can just acknowledge them and then learn from them and move on. And there's nobody that you know, not your parents, not your grandparents, who haven't done the same, especially at your age, who didn't do some things that they thought were irredeemably goofy or wrong or careless or foolish. So I just wanted to say that to you guys, and to take pride in just having kind of survived this period, and let it be part of what carries you forward. I know that probably all of your teachers, or most of your teachers, I hope, believe that their subject is really important and their material is really important. And so it's kind of like a lot of kids standing around you yelling, pay attention to me, pay attention to me, all the time. Good morning, Kayla. And it's hard to know sometimes where to pay attention. I don't think that my classes are the most important, because that's a really strange idea anyway. But the reason I think that something like learning how to read a poem is valuable, because it teaches you to pay attention. And Muriel Rukeyser, a wonderful poet, who was also an activist and sort of established the organization called PEN, where they would fight for writers who were in exile or in prison or sometimes in danger of their lives. Carolyn Forche, whom I know some of you really got to see last week and experience her presence and her words, is part of that kind of movement of poets. And Muriel Rukeyser used to say, poetry lives where the deeper meanings are. And I think it can be easy to lose track of where the deeper meanings are in our lives. So if poetry becomes something that will help bring you back to those touchstones, that is a valuable thing. And I do believe that poetry teaches us empathy and to notice the beauty of the world, to be aware of what powerful language can do and the differences it can make. And often poets really are seeing a little further into the future than we are. And so they help clarify the path forward. And sometimes they're there just to show you that other people have gone through similar times or similar experiences, and they've left this kind of pathway for us through the swampy places and the dark places in the woods, and we can have a sense that someone else has gone there before us. So those are the reasons that I believe poetry is important. And I think any activity you engage in is worth engaging with, not just in a kind of pro forma way or perfunctory way, but somehow with your heart and mind and soul involved and committed. And as I said, I'm really proud of some of you who have been able to do that, So here we are, and I'm going to now begin teaching class after having talked to you for 9 minutes. And no, I don't offer any classes in the spring, because I don't teach in the spring. I always only teach in the fall. I have what they call a part-time, full-time appointment. So I'm tenured, and I am technically still here in the spring, but I don't teach in the spring. I've been thinking about doing a summer class, but I'm just not sure how I feel about that. I was also thinking this morning that if I could only teach you guys and never have to grade you, I would be so much happier. I really would. That's the part I hate, is having to keep track of, did you hand it in on time, and how did you do on your quiz, and you know, all of that. So if I could just respond to people and respond to their writings and, kind of give them the advice and suggestions that I could, and then move on from there, um, man, that would be, to me, that would be ideal. And that's really ironic because I went to a college where they decided not to give grades anymore, but because I'd come in when they still did, you had the option of having grades or just getting comments. And I chose to get grades as well as comments. And so I've come kind of around about 180 degrees to think, yeah, I think education would be better if we didn't get graded at all. I think I honestly do believe that. I don't think it's doing anybody any particular good, to be graded, because, as I said before, you really know deep inside how you've been doing, and there's no such thing as a teacher failing a student. A student has to make that decision themselves, really. Um, the decision not to do the work, the decision not to study or come to class or whatever it might be. So I don't think you really need somebody standing over you to say that that happened. But I think I'm greatly in the minority there. So I wanted to start, um, first of all, with a thank you to Daisy, because I think that was a wonderful presentation that you did last week. And your reading of Nothing Gold Can stayed with me. And I was really delighted to find this poem in a recent issue of the New Yorker. It's called September 1st again. And it's about the turning of leaves and, um, that whole idea of time moving on and things changing and things being cyclical, and being able to let go of summer, for instance, to move into fall, and then appreciating the snow, and even the bareness of the trees can have a kind of beauty to them, sort of a structural beauty. So, September 1st, again, by Phyllis Levin. Blighted light at the tip of a branch. Why so early do you turn? Leaf dipped in vermilion. Close to the end, you point to a sidewalk wet once with names, signed in cement to seal for all time a vow uttered by two standing under the crown of a tree you cleave to still. For now, solitary witness standing alone, limbs crisscrossing in shadows, beginning to scrawl lines to a world hell-bent, with or without intent, on obscuring whatever they meant. Blighted light at the topmost bough, little flag hailing another day. Do not go so early to ruin. Green, do not turn so soon. So, September 1st again. I love the idea of the, how people like write their names in cement, and sometimes couples do that. They put a heart around it. I love how that's included somehow in the things one does when young. Of course, I still run out there and write my daughter's initials in the wet cement, somewhat to the dismay of the city workers who come by. But it's okay. We talk about it and it's all right. And here's the poem that I mentioned last week when Adam recited his poem. I mentioned that there was a poet from El Salvador who had written a poem also about Don't Say My Name, but it's a very different kind of poem. And it's sort of my introduction to you guys to the poetry of witness that we are talking about today. So this poem is by a poet named Roque Dalton, who was a poet, a journalist, an activist, a communist living in El Salvador. And he was murdered in 1975, a death that he predicts in this poem. So it's called Small Hours of the Night. When you know I'm dead, don't say my name, because then death and peace would have to wait. Your voice, the bell of your five senses, would form the thin beam of light my mist would be looking for. When you know I'm dead, say other words. Say flower, bee, teardrop, bread, storm. Don't let your lips find my 11 letters. I'm sleepy, I've loved, I've earned silence. Don't say my name when you know I'm dead. I would come out of the dark ground for your voice. Don't say my name, don't say my name. When you know I'm dead, don't say my name. Okay, so I am going to move on to Pablo Neruda. He was a Chilean poet. He was raised with a certain degree of, I would say, wealth and comfort. And when he was a young man, he was sent to Spain as a sort of baby diplomat, and that was something that the Latin American, South American countries used to do with their young artists. It's a typical way to support Latin American writers. In the poem I gave you guys, I'm explaining a few things. Neruda is writing about the Spanish Civil War. So what was happening was that you had kind of duly elected leaders for the Republic, and then some sort of thugs who would seize power, and then it would go back, and then it would go back and forth, and there was really a battle between the Republicans and the sort of brutal fascist / military dictatorship of Franco, who was head of the Nationalist Party, and actually ended up ruling from 1939 until he died in the mid-70s, I think 1975, which is really sort of shocking to think about. There was a certain sort of cult following that he had, but he also murdered many of his own people. And I sort of find it interesting how how so many of the movements that are run by people who turn out to be dictators call themselves a nationalist party. You know, we talked about that earlier in the semester, and how that way of thinking can be potentially so dangerous, right? Because as soon as you talk about putting your own country first, you begin to other all other countries. You begin to engage in a sort of us against them mentality. And it won't take long before you begin to do that within your own country, that there will be an us and a them, you know, red states and blue states, or white and black, or whatever the divisions might be perceived to be. But I think so often it starts with nationalism, or what I might call religionism, you know, a way of kind of claiming ground. And it just seems so silly to me, especially now that we've sent people out to outer space and we've seen that beautiful, fragile, green, blue planet we live on. And, you know, the demarcations are not there. So, anyway, Neruda became a senator for a poor coal mining region of Chile on his return from Spain. He was a supporter of the democratically elected leader, President Allende. But when Allende was overthrown by the military and headed by a man named Pinochet, another very brutal kind of regime, Neruda went into hiding, being handed in a sort of informal Underground Railway situation from one sort of coal miner's house to another. And they kind of snuck him out of the country and kept him safe as needed. And he lived abroad for a time. For instance, in Italy, where a movie called The Postman takes place. Have any of you ever seen a movie called The Postman? It was just beautiful. Probably came out 25 years ago now, and has lovely music. It's very romantic. And it's about this postman who is in love with a woman in his town in this little place in Italy, but he's too shy and awkward to tell her how he feels. And Neruda is living in exile. And Neruda encourages him to begin to kind of open his eyes and look around and sort of become a poet himself in the deeper sense so that he can court this woman. It's sweet. It's also sort of heartrending in many ways, and there are political things going on that are very difficult in the movie, but I would definitely recommend it. And maybe I will try to post under the course content a couple of recordings that were done connected to the Postman, like to the music from the Postman by famous, rock stars and actors and so on, reading Neruda poems. And I am often a little suspicious of actors and actresses reading poems because I feel like I don't know, sometimes they kind of ham it up, but I think these are beautiful. And Madonna, for instance, reads a poem called If You Forget Me. And I think it's Antonio Banderas recites another poem. And there are quite a few of them. So I'll see if I can find a couple of my favorites. Anyway, after having been an exile abroad for some years, he did return eventually to Chile and had a house in Santiago, which overlooked the sea. That's where he had his study and did his work. And he was sent to the hospital for cancer treatment. So his health was fragile. And it's been said that Pinochet's men came in and turned off his machines in the hospital. So they didn't directly murder him, which would have been Franco's way in Spain, but it was sort of a murder by attrition, so to speak. And then they went to his house in Santiago and tried to destroy every trace of this poet who had worked so hard to speak for the working class and to speak for the poor and so on. So they smashed his desk in his study, and they threw all the papers out, and they took their axes to the building itself, and they left it a complete wreck, in the hope that no one would be able to, sort of resurrect this figure who meant a lot to the people. But the people of Santiago actually went into his house and they reassembled the desk and they put the house back together. And so they restored it somehow. And I believe it stands to this day as a kind of monument to Neruda. And it was the people themselves who really did that and created that. And I think that's really beautiful. All right, so I'm explaining a few things by Pablo Neruda, who lived, by the way, from 1904 to 1973. Kind of shocking to think that Franco outlived him. And I forgot to tell you this, but the translation here was actually done by me and a former student of mine named Alvin Delgado, who was from Puerto Rico. You are going to ask, and where are the lilacs? and the poppy-petaled metaphysics, and the rain repeatedly spattering its words and drilling them full of apertures and birds. I'll tell you all the news. I lived in a suburb of Madrid, with bells and clocks and trees. From there you could look out over Castile's dry face, a leather ocean. My house was called the House of Flowers because in every cranny geraniums burst. It was a good-looking house with its dogs and children. Remember Raoul? Raphael? Federico? Do you remember from under the ground my balconies on which the light of June drowned flowers in your mouth? Brother, my brother, everything, loud with big voices, the salt of merchandises, pile-ups of palpitating bread, the stalls of my suburb of Aguels with its statue like a drained inkwell in a swirl of hake oil flowed into spoons, a deep baying of feet and hands swelled in the streets, meters, liters, the sharp measure of life, stacked up fish, the texture of roofs with a cold sun in which the weather vane falters, the fine frenzied ivory of potatoes, wave on wave of tomatoes rolling down the sea. And one morning, all that was burning. One morning, the bonfires leapt out of the earth, devouring human beings. And from then on, fire. Gunpowder from then on, and from then on, blood. Bandits with planes and moors. Bandits with finger rings and duchesses. Bandits with black friars spattering blessings came through the sky to kill children, and the blood of children ran through the streets without fuss, like children's blood. Jackals that the jackals would despise. Stones that the dry thistle would bite on and spit out. Vipers that the vipers would abominate. Face to face with you, I have seen the blood of Spain tower like a tide to drown you in one wave of pride and knives. Treacherous generals, see my dead house. Look at broken Spain. From every house, burning metal flows instead of flowers. From every socket of Spain, Spain emerges, and from every dead child, a rifle with eyes, and from every crime, bullets are born, which will one day find the bullseyes of your hearts. And you will ask, why doesn't his poetry speak of dreams and leaves and the great volcanoes of his native land? Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. So these poets of witness, as we call them, are, I think they're very powerful poets, and they're doing something rather new. Just as, the poets we read last week, Baudelaire and Rimbaud, were doing something sort of radical and new by mixing up the meanings, and Whitman was doing something radical and new by kind of taking the lid off the pot and letting lines flow as they would, kind of in a more oceanic way. Maybe all the great poets are always doing something radical for their time and new in their way. And the idea of a poetry of witness really has to do, I think, with something Neruda said. I believe it's in his memoir, that he wrote to give voice to the voiceless. To give voice to the voiceless is, I think, um, a goal of all these poets of witness. Sometimes they write from out of the middle of a crisis, as when, we read the poems that were written during the Holocaust inside the concentration camps, or in any other sort of situation where people are in extremis, right? In extreme situations, and they want to write about what's happening, to tell us all the news. I think in your own way, actually, and I believe Carolyn Forche spoke about this as well. She said, you will be able to write your own words of witness about the time you're going through, about being young and living your lives, and then suddenly having everything around you change and close down, and, being afraid perhaps, and knowing people who were in danger or got sick, and having come through that, which I'm sure you will be a very powerful thing to write about and speak about and remember. And so I think you're all going to be poets of witness, whether you put it into your poetry or not. So it will be very interesting to see what you have to say. And I hope some of you are keeping notebooks or journals of these days as well, even if they seem fragmentary or trivial or unfinished to you now. I think you'll look at them later and be grateful that you kept some kind of a record. So, at the beginning of the poem, Neruda says, you're going to ask, and where are the lilacs? So he knows that his readers are used to a kind of a lush poetry from Neruda. He was wonderful at writing these passionate love poems. A little less wonderful, I think, at actually being a partner, but wonderful about writing poems for his beloveds. And, writing the kind of poetry that we have been reading, where there are lots of poems about flowers and the changing seasons and the beauty around us. And he sort of starts with that challenge, in a sense, as if he's saying, I know what you expect from me. I know the kind of poetry you expect me to write, and it would be full of lilacs and poppies and metaphysics and philosophical musings, and rain. But even in that first stanza, there's something a little scary going on. There's already a hint that this poem is, in fact, not going to be a poem about lilacs and birds and metaphysics in the classical sense. I mean, even if you look at the idea of the rain drilling in full of apertures, the drilling sounds kind of scary. And apertures are, they're spaces we can look through, but they're also kind of holes, right? So it almost gives you that sense of the gunshots that we're going to be experiencing later, right? There's a hint of those guns even here at the beginning with the drilling something full of holes. And he says, I'll tell you all the news, which I find a kind of mysterious line. I would really love to hear what you guys think when he says that. Because, when somebody says to me something like, I'll tell you all the news, it feels like they're going to tell me gossip. They're going to tell me personal news, sort of, they're going to spill the tea. And that's not what he's doing here, is it? It's not really like news that you hear reported either, not in newspapers, not on TV. It's a lot more direct in some ways and a lot more indirect in other ways. And he places us in a place of comfort And it's a false comfort. And that's the point. He believed himself to be in that place of comfort as well until it all began falling apart. So he's describing how he lived in this lovely suburb of Madrid with bells and clocks and trees. Um, and again, there's a little hint of something wrong because an ocean shouldn't really be a leather ocean. There's something kind of frozen stiff about that image. But his house was called the House of Flowers because there were so many flowers around it, right? You know, people who keep lots of hanging baskets on their porches and things blooming in every nook and cranny. I love houses like that. I try to do that with my own house. It was a good looking house with its dogs and children. So, you know, there you have almost a children's book, right? You have the dog, you have the kids, you have the nice house, you have the flowers. And then he sort of turns aside. And Skinlanda, I love that idea that it's like when someone says, I need to talk to you, or we need to talk, right? That definitely, that definitely always gives me anxiety when someone says we need to talk. I know my daughter dreads it when I say, honey, come downstairs. We have something to talk about, or we need to talk about something. It's, you know, it's going to be followed up by something like, you know, you need to not see your friends who are going to school every day, or something like that, right? But he sort of turns aside at this moment in the poem, and he's been talking to us, right? He said, you were going to ask, I'll tell you the news, you could look out. And then he's suddenly talking to other people. Somebody named Raul and Rafael and Federico. So I can tell you that Raul is Raul Gonzalez Tuñón, an Argentinian poet, sort of avant-garde writer and a fellow communist. Rafael Alberti was another radical poet who was exiled, went into exile. And Federico, who he saves for last, Federico Garcia Lorca, is kind of considered the great poet of Spain, right? He was gay, he was outspoken, he was a voice again for the people, and he was murdered by Franco's men. In fact, he was forced to dig his own grave before they shot him and then put him in it. So the poem really turns here. This is really where it turns, because he is, you know, addressing his sort of fellow fighters, and one of them has already fallen. So do you remember from under the ground? You know, it kind of reminds me of that poem, Small Hours of the Night by Brooke Dalton, right? Don't say my name because I would rise to find you. I would have to, you know, leave death behind just to seek you out. So he's asking, do you remember my balconies, the light of June drowned flowers in your mouth? And that is a gorgeous line, isn't it? Even at the same moment that he's telling us, don't expect any gorgeous poetry from me, he, of course, is who he is and does give us gorgeous poetry. And then you have that beautiful sort of outburst of brother, my brother, you know. And then we start to have a sense of the chaos of this place. You know, first it's a kind of happy chaos, right? Marketplaces and people measuring their produce, and the texture of roofs and fish piled up, and that amazing image of the fine frenzied ivory of potatoes, or the waves of tomatoes rolling down to the sea. But then he says all that was burning. And one morning, all that was burning. Of course, that's not really how things happen. It doesn't exactly happen all in one morning, just like COVID didn't happen all in one day. It kind of was gradually approaching us. I don't know for you guys when um, when you began to feel that things were changing and heading to us. I definitely felt it as soon as it hit Europe, and especially when I saw what was happening in Italy and Spain. I was kind of bracing myself. So I'm sure it was that way. Sometimes there is a kind of triggering event that you might point to. Um, but he is very powerful when he is speaking of those who came in the name of destruction, came to destroy this kind of human life that was being lived. And he does a lot of repetition, as I'm sure you have noticed. I hope you will have noticed. There are the sort of qualities of poetry, even when you may not recognize something like a formal meter or rhyme. Um, you have, and one morning, and from then on fire, gunpowder from then on, and from then on blood. Right? Those repetitions build up a kind of momentum. I think they build up a kind of anxiety also. Bandits with planes, bandits with finger rings, bandits with black friars spattering blessings. And that reminded me of the darkening church, every darkening church, blackening church of Paul's. Do you remember Blake writing about that? As if they're sort of looking at these children, these child chimney sweeps they're sending out to do this really dangerous and dirty work. And sure enough, came through the sky to kill children. And the blood of children ran through the streets without fuss, like children's blood. Something so heartbreaking about that, isn't there, really? The slaughter of innocents, there's nothing quite as terrible as that. That's why, for me anyway, the last administration was really over for me when we were putting children into cages. And the idea that Americans could live and allow that to be going on in their own country was just so unbearable to me. I think you really can measure a society by how they treat their most vulnerable people, right? So children and old people and people with various disabilities, you watch that and you'll know where you are, kind of. I had a friend who worked, I think, as a diplomat all over the world, really, literally. I mean, he was sent to Africa, and he was sent to the Middle East, and he was sent to every corner of the world. And he came back and he said, Liz, I could always tell, I could measure a civilization by how it treated its women. And I think that's a comparable idea, because in many countries, women do constitute a particularly vulnerable portion of the population. And the more vulnerable you make them, the more it shows that your civilization is not really civilized yet. And then, by the end, he begins to really, really tell us all the news. Treacherous general, see my dead house. Look at broken Spain. So that lovely house with the flowers and geraniums, it has died. And the country that he visited and came to love is broken. And instead of the volcanoes of his native country, remember at the beginning, they're saying, where are the lilacs and the poppy petaled metaphysics and, the volcanoes of your native country? It's this sort of lava, this burning metal is flowing from inside of the houses. And instead of flowers from every socket of Spain, you can't help but sort of envision eye sockets there, right? Spain emerges, and from every dead child, a rifle with eyes, and from every crime, bullets are born. I mean, he's smart. He knows that hatred begets hatred, right? Violence is only going to create more violence in the future, um, which will one day find the bullseyes of your hearts. Um, the killers set up their own deaths in a way. Uh, they become the targets for the murdered, right? There's that sense that, revenge and karma are inevitable. And you begin this kind of cycle that you're going to be part of yourself. And you begin a cycle that, how do you break out of it? It's like the cycle of family violence, when there are parents who, physically abuse their children, and then those children grow up and they do it. And sort of like, when and how do you break that cycle? When does somebody have the courage to step out of that cycle? And then he goes back and says, and you'll ask, why doesn't his poetry speak of dreams and leaves and the great volcanoes of his native land? And why doesn't he just kind of shut up and go back to writing about trees and leaves and, picturesque scenes? And here's the answer. And I think that anything that you could ever want to know about line breaks, you could find in this last stanza of this poem, because how he breaks the line changes the meaning every single time. And I think it's just pure genius to be able to do this. So the first line of the last stanza is, come and see the blood in the streets. And that's a statement of fact, right? It's declarative. Then he says, come and see. Just come and see. Like, calling to us to come and do something. Now he's calling upon the you to do something. The blood in the streets is a fragment now, right? It forces you to think about this one aspect of what's happening. There's the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood, right? That's the essence of it. He's not going to gussy this up for us. Come and see the blood in the streets. It's everywhere. It's around you. If you walk outside your house, this is what you will see if you have your eyes open. So those 5 lines, I think, are just amazing in the way they present something. And of course, he's repeating it. He repeats the same thing, the same statement 3 times. Above, I saw somebody, yes, his repetition, I read like he is crying out. Angelica, I think that's exactly right. If you say something 3 times, you're really crying it out. And then the way he breaks up those statements that he says 3 times makes it even more real to us, right? Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. Come and see the blood in the streets. It changes the pace, it changes the rhythm. Matt, you're right, it changes the focus. It emphasizes different things. Almost like, what I picture is almost like somebody taking rapid fire photographs with a camera. You can see that in old movies and you hear that sound of the shutter. It captures a moment, and it sort of breaks it up almost. There's a little bit of that feeling as well. Is it there? So, um, Neyrud is a beautiful poet, and he did really, I think, try to speak for the voiceless as best he could. All right, I'm going to move on to um, Anna Akhmatova, and probably going to say rather little about Carolyn Forche for now, because I wanted to leave that open for conversation on Thursday. We're going to have a couple more uh, of you reciting poems. Chloe, I know you're one of them, and I got until 50 minutes ago. I knew who the other one was, but anyway, I'm really looking forward to it. And then I thought we would, again, sort of break into small groups and have a conversation about The Colonel, which is a really, really tough poem. I don't think I could ever read that poem out loud. I'm not sure. I'm just not sure I could kind of make my way through it, if you know what I mean. I will ask you, though, when you guys are reading it and when you're talking about it, to notice who gets to speak in that poem and who doesn't, and what are the effects of um, the rhythms she writes in. You'll see there are a lot of short declarative sentences. So why would she write it that way? Why would she write it in prose, for that matter? All right, Anna Akhmatova was born in Odessa in Ukraine in 1889 to wealthy parents. Her family moved to just north of Petersburg, a very fancy area that the Tsar used to go to as a sort of second home, and a lot of the Russian nobility would also stay there. She began writing poetry when she was a very young teenager. She made friends with a man who was a poetry editor and poet himself. And her father so disapproved of her writing poetry that she actually changed her writing name. She wasn't born under the name Akhmatova, but I think she felt that her father would feel shamed if there was a poet in the family with his name. So she wrote under the name Anna Akhmatova. She ended up marrying that editor. And he was later assassinated on what seemed to be trumped up charges. I think the main thing to skip to now in her life is the fact that she lived through a great deal of difficult history in Russia, I mean, to say the least. During World War II, a lot of her friends escaped to England and other places in Europe. Akhmatova refused to go. And I think that's one of the main reasons she is still a sort of heroine, a particular heroine to the people of Russia, because they see her as someone who remained firmly Russian. And despite all of the terrible things she saw and witnessed and lived through, she never abandoned her sort of mother Russia. Now, during the rule of Stalin, right, as most dictators do, he went after the intellectuals, he went after the students, he went after the radicals, the socialists, the artists, and so almost everyone that Akhmatova had known, and she knew all of the poets. She'd had affairs with probably half of them. I mean, everybody from Pasternak to Mandelstam, and her own, the person that she lived with for many years. So sort of her common law husband, I suppose, as well as her son Lev, who was the child of her first early marriage, became victims or targets of Stalin. And her son was in prison for quite a long time, and her partner was sent off to one of the gulags, right? This sort of work/concentration camps in places like Siberia. Millions, literally millions of Russians were murdered under Stalin, and millions more sent again into exile, into these gulags, these sort of really um, harsh prison places under almost completely unlivable circumstances where people, were basically worked to death. They were sent to hard labor. Some of them survived, some of them did not. Akhmatova was silenced, then allowed to write, then silenced again, then sort of bribed, in a sense, bullied into writing a kind of almost propaganda poetry for um, for Stalin and for his rule. That was when her son Lev was in prison, and she was terrified. They certainly threatened to kill him if she didn't do this. And all this time, though, she was writing her real poetry. And this is how it would go. She would write her poems. Her friends would come over and read them and memorize them. And then they would burn the poem, the copy of the poem that they had just read and memorized. And they would keep saying it by heart. And when they would leave the country, they would bring the poetry with them. And that is how her poems were smuggled out from under the Stalin regime. One of the sort of thugs who worked with Stalin called Akhmatova half nun, half whore. They just didn't know what to do with her. They didn't know what box to sort of put her in, and they really never quite found one. So she survived all that. She lived into the 60s. She was shortlisted for the Nobel Prize. And I just especially do love this poem called Epilogue. So there's a sort of epigraph to this poem. And the Yezhov terror is, of course, basically the Stalin terror. There was a particular man named Yezhov who was the head of the Secret Service police. Needless to say, not a nice guy. And so they called it the Yezhov terror, the Great Purge, all of that. Basically went from about 1936 to 1938. It was a particularly dark time in the life of Russia under Stalin. So, in the fearful years of the Yezhov terror, I spent 17 months in prison lines in Leningrad. One day somebody recognized me. Beside me in the line stood a woman with blue lips. She had, of course, never heard of me, but she suddenly came out of that trance so common to us all and whispered in my ear. Everyone spoke in whispers there. Can you describe this? And I said, yes, I think I can. And then something like the shadow of a smile crossed what had once been her face. It's such a small piece of writing, but it tells us so much about what that time was like. Akhmatova, became famous pretty early on as this flamboyant poet who wrote about her love affairs and sort of bohemian lifestyle. And she is, in fact, a gorgeous poet of all those things. She's an amazing love poet. She writes about what a broken heart really feels like and waiting for someone to come by who never comes. And so you don't sleep all night waiting for the sound of those footsteps or the knock on the door. But in this moment, it really doesn't matter, does it? I mean, she's just another mother standing on this long line where people would wait to hear any news of their child or husband or relative who was there in prison, or possibly the chance to sneak a note through or a little bit of food or something, and they would wait and wait and wait on these lines together. And of course, this woman is asking her, can you describe this? Can you write about this time? And Akhmatova says, agrees to do it. Yes, I think I can. And then the woman sort of smiles on what was sort of her normal face before she went through all of this terror and anxiety. Um, so there I learned how faces fall apart, how fear looks out from under the eyelids, how deep are the hieroglyphs carved by suffering on people's cheeks. There I learned how silver can inherit the black, the ash blonde overnight. The smiles that drifted from the core and spirit, terror's dry coughing sound. And I pray not only for myself, but for all those who stood for hours in bitter cold or in July heat under that red, blind prison wall. Again, the hands of the clock draw near the unforgettable hour. I see, hear, touch all of you. The cripple they had to support painfully to the end of the line, the nearly dead, and the girl who would shake her lovely head and say, I come here as if it were home. I would love to call you all by name, but they have lost the lists. I have woven for them a great shroud out of the poor words I overheard them speak. I remember them always and everywhere. And if they seal my tormented mouth, through which 100 million of my people cry, let them remember me also. And if ever in this country they should want to build me a monument, I consent to that honor only on condition that they erect it not on the seashore where I was born. My last links there were broken long ago, nor by the stump in the royal gardens where an inconsolable young shade is seeking me, but here where I stood for 300 hours and where they never opened the doors for me. Lest in blessed death I should forget the grinding scream of the black Mariahs, the hideous clanging gate, the old woman wailing like a wounded beast, and may the melting snow drop like heavy tears from my motionless bronze eyelids, and the prison pigeons coo above me, and the ships sail slowly down the Neva. So she's trying to describe what that was like, those, what did she say, 19 months, 17 months she spent in prison lines in Leningrad waiting for word of her son and her partner and many of her friends, among so many others. And she talks about, the hieroglyphs, right? The wrinkles carved on people's faces, those deep frown lines that people have around their mouths, the worry lines across the forehead. People whose hair was silver overnight. Mine did not was silver overnight, but sometimes make jokes about that, but today. How they stood there in the cold or the burning hot sun, and the people standing on the line, how she remembers them. Like the girl who says, I come here every day as if it were home, as if I lived here, right? This is more like my home than my home is. Because my home is only where I wait to be able to come here and wait again and be closer to the person I am waiting for. And that thing about, I would love to call you all by name. Right? Again, we have that idea of the name. Right, Adam, you kind of raised that last week with your poem, and then we have that in Roke Dalton. They have lost the lists. I don't think they just lost those lists. I think they wanted to erase. They wanted to erase those they had killed, those they had exiled. And she is determined not to let them be erased and not to let the people who waited for them and loved them and cared for them be erased. her solidarity with um, her people, so that even if her mouth is sealed, somehow the voice of those 100 millions still speaks through her. And she says, if you build me a monument, you should build it right here where I stood on one. Not by that beautiful seashore um, where the nobility and the czar used to have their second homes, not in this royal garden. She has other poems about a young man who was so in love with her that I think he actually went off and committed suicide. That's a story that arises in her poems sometimes over and over. But here, where I stood for 300 hours and where they never, never opened the doors for me. It's kind of like what Ali and Angelica are saying also about how the simplicity of lines can have so much power. Ooh, it's 11:11. Skidlanda, I am remembering you, and we can all make wishes at this moment. But when she says, and where they never, never opened the doors for me, it's almost a childlike voice in some ways. Um, and it's so simple, but it's so powerful. Blessed death, I should forget, the grinding scream of the Black Mariahs. Do any of you know what the Black Mariahs are? Um, they are police wagons, the wagons that come to take you to prison, take you away. In this case, of course, they would have been coming to this prison to bring still more people to be um, walled up behind those red blind prison walls. And then the old woman wailing like a wounded beast. And I don't know if that's because some word of someone's death has reached her, or if she just has sort of reached the end of her rope. I always feel like it's someone who has gotten news. But now that I see it's the hideous clanging gate, I suppose it could be the new arrival. It could be the old woman wailing over someone she knows is inside that police van. And may the melting snow drop like heavy tears from my motionless bronze eyelids. It's if she'll never stop weeping for her people. Even after death, even if they make her a statue, she will still stand guard over them and with them. And then that image of the prison pigeons cooing above me. There's this sense that somehow this business of throwing people into prisons doesn't seem like it's likely to stop. And the ship sails slowly down the Neva. The Neva is the great sort of broad river that runs through St. Petersburg, called Leningrad here. I have been there a few times, both when it was Leningrad and when it was St. Petersburg again. And so some of these places they're kind of like totemic. They're almost mythical, mythological. Like the River Neva just kind of stands for this part of Russia. And St. Petersburg was always considered the sort of the arts capital of Russia, the sort of lighter, happier, more intellectual place. Moscow was the seat of power. It was more of the center of things that would kind of then rule the country. St. Petersburg was closer to Europe. It was more European in feel. I suppose it is a little Parisian in its way, but I think it's so essentially Russian, really. And they have, like this enormous statue of think it's one of the czars standing on a horse overlooking a bridge that crosses the Neva, and these incredible old cathedrals with huge columns made out of semi-precious gems, the entire column. I think there was a column made of jade and another made of malachite. Um, so sometimes when you look at the kind of wealth that belonged to the royal families, that was part of the sort of czar existence, or Catherine and so on. I remember that she ate some kind of soup that was entirely made of fish cheeks. And my husband and I used to joke about that all the time. I mean, how many fish are you killing just to get the cheeks and then eat them? That's crazy. I mean, that was just crazy. And one of her houses was coated in gold, real gold leaf. And then she got tired of it. So they had to take the gold leaf off, but none of it was allowed to go to anyone. None of it was given to the people. It had to all be thrown into the sea and or some river. And again, I remember saying to my husband, I wonder how many people went swimming after that gold, went to go retrieve some of it. Sort of helps you understand why all those revolutions happened. But again, it kind of goes back to the Neruda poem, right? That the bloody cycles kind of create more cycles, which create more cycles. And the important thing is to find a way to break those cycles of kind of violence, abuse of the people, indifference to what happens to others. Anyway, so there you go. There's Neruda, and there's Akhmatova, and we will be talking about Caroline Forget's poem, The Colonel, the next time we meet. Those of you who were there for her visit to us will have heard some of the things I said when I introduced her, but I guess I'll just tell you now, if it's helpful for you, that she was born in Michigan in 1950. She came from a very working class family and had very few expectations of her own life. She has a beautiful poem she wrote for her best friend from sort of, I guess, their childhood and early teenage years. They would dream of someday breaking free of this life and going to Paris. And she writes this poem to tell her friend that she has made it to Paris. And she said she wrote it partly in the hope that the friend would somehow hear the poem or hear of the poem, and they would be back in touch. And I remember asking her a few times had she ever heard from the friend. And last I heard, she had not. I wonder if by now, with all the social media that's out there, maybe she has. But she won the Yale Younger Series Poetry Award, which is a very fancy sort of poetry honor. And I think her first book, it's called Gathering the Tribes, and it was a lovely book. But in some ways, how do I describe it? Like a regular book of poems. Do you know what I mean? Like a standard, lovely book of poems. And, kind of first person, lots of memories, lots of family poems. She was very good at it. And then she was sort of tapped to go be an aide-de-camp and visit El Salvador. And that's when her life really changed. I would say that's when she became kind of radicalized and politicized in a way she had never been before, because she made friends with a particular priest who worked closely with the poor people of El Salvador and with some of the people who were resisting the incredibly, cruel rule that was going on there in El Salvador, where they kept killing people and they would sort of hide the bodies. So they were called the disappeared. And it would usually be young men. And it would usually be young men who had spoken out against the government or were suspected of working against this sort of brutal regime in some way. And it was when Carolyn Forget was there, for instance, that she was um, snuck into the prison she describes in her memoir and in a few of her poems in The Country Between Us, where she saw that men were actually being kept in cages. I talked to you just a little while ago about children in cages. These were really tiny cages, like you might keep a cat in. And sometimes these men were kept there for as long as a year. And she knew she had to come home and speak about it and write about it, which she did. Um, and she was both attacked and celebrated for doing this. And some people said you have no right to write these poems about a country that you really don't know enough about. It's not your culture. It's not your business. It's not poetry's business to be political. This is not what poetry is supposed to be. Go back to the lilacs and the poppy petal metaphysics. Then there were others who said this is amazing and wonderful. This is a new kind of poetry in America that we need, that is connected to what's happening elsewhere in the world. So she became a rather controversial poet. And one of the things I love about Carolyn, we have known each other now for probably, maybe 35 years or something like that. And we're sort of both young punks, I guess, when we first met. And she takes her time between her books and poems. I love that about her because, The Country Between Us made kind of an enormous splash. She could easily have come out with her next book in a year or two, which is typically what poets do, actually. Some poets just like crank out one book after another. And I think she took maybe 10 years before she published her next book. And then another like 15 books before the next. I saw the first draft of her memoir, I want to say at least 20 years ago, and it was pretty rough. I gotta tell you guys, it was pretty rough. But she kept at it, and she is a beautiful writer and just a remarkable person. So, The Colonel is undoubtedly her best known poem. Uh, Again, it's somewhat controversial. Um, there are people who say this could never have happened, this never happened. Um, there are others who say she needed to write this poem, she needed to let people know that these things really were happening. Anyway, I'm going to let you guys discuss this yourselves on Thursday, and I'm looking forward to reading your mini submissions. I've only read like a couple because the other class had submitted their mini submissions first. So I think I now have only one left for the other class, and I've already read a couple in this group. So, all right. I love you guys. Make sure that you say goodbye to me now. I know you said hello. I would like you to say goodbye as well. And does anyone have any questions for me about anything? Okay. Hearing none, as they say, I think, in the courtrooms, um, I'm just going to ask you guys to say goodbye before we leave class. Okay? Thank you guys. Take care.